actions left people, even in the ACLU and at Harvard Law School, scratching their heads about what is being produced here and why. Because the consensus seems to be that between the Patriot Act and other laws, that this was not necessary and now is a truly dangerous threat to American civil liberties.
Jonathan, in theory, with this now law, if they didn't like what's going on with these Occupy Wall Street protesters, if they didn't like somebody protesting our stand in Afghanistan, who would push the button to get these people picked up and arrested?
Well, the language of the statute is so ambiguous. If you substantially support a terrorist organization, you may be arrested. What is substantially support? What does that mean? Well, that's going to be the determination of a political leader. It's going to be the president's determination in the last analysis. That person is going to say, all right, well, I think that person substantially supports terrorism. Well, let's say you have a person who is unfortunately predisposed to making rash statements and anti-American statements, which is their right, and they make a statement in support of Al-Qaeda or some other organization, but have taken no step to arm themselves to attack the United States in any way or to facilitate that.
Right. Just simply uses rhetoric.
Yes. Well, that person could be arrested under an interpretation which will be made by the executive department if a president wished to incarcerate them or was told by advisors, this person's dangerous, this person is making these statements which are encouraging terrorism domestically and internationally. We think they're affiliated with these people because of the statements they've made. They can be arrested and thrown into a military camp and kept there, and there'd be no opportunity for a judge and a jury to assess whether this was some rash college kid or person who is unstable or who shouldn't be incarcerated because they aren't a threat, or whether it is actually someone who is in aid of terrorism. So what you have here is the root of all evil, which is the right to engage in arbitrary discretion in the hands of those who have military power, who can determine in an instant whether one person or another person goes to jail and can enforce that in the dark of night, like this law was created without public scrutiny. A public trial is guaranteed by the Sixth Amendment. It's public precisely because even with a public trial, the American people are entitled to a check on abuses that take place in the judicial system. And when you have a military tribunal, it is necessarily one that is cloaked in secrecy, and people can be destroyed. This is the history of the Civil War with the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus and ex parte McCardle, when, Abraham Lincoln famously said, Justice Taney has his ruling, now let him enforce it. When he refused to enforce a writ of habeas corpus from Justice Taney, compelling him to release John Merriman out of Copperhead, a sympathizer with the Confederacy, out of Maryland. And this suspension of this writ of habeas corpus, which there was unconstitutional and is here unconstitutional, is the greatest threat to individual liberty. We have this thing called the Great Writ of habeas corpus.
Well, Jonathan, I am so glad we've got you watching some of these things. Thank you so much for your work. Up next, David Seaman joins us, independent journalist, along with Linda Moulton Howe, as we continue talking about the NDAA. Special report tonight on the National Defense Authorization Act, whittling away at your constitutional rights. Linda Moulton Howe with me, and up next, David Seaman joins us. I'll tell you about him when we come right back. And welcome back to Coast. Linda Moulton Howe with us, and David Seaman joins us this half hour. David is an independent journalist, frequent contributor to Business Insider. He's been a guest on CNN's Headline News, Fox News, ABC News Digital, among others. He's got his own YouTube channel, David Seaman Online, as well. And welcome to Coast. David, thanks for coming on tonight.
Thanks for having me on.
Tell me your interest in the NDAA. How did you learn about this?
Sure. So basically what happened is I get tips from my readers on all kinds of topics, and I just sort of pursue them all. And a lot of them don't pan out, but every once in a while you get something good. And I was sent a link to Wired Magazine's blog. They did a posting about the National Defense Authorization Act, which at that point was still in progress. It hadn't yet been approved by the Senate and the House, and it hadn't yet been sent to Obama's desk, but it was still a major concern, and they wrote about it, and their piece was really accurate and factual and well-sourced, but it just wasn't getting much pickup. So I sort of, just drew people's attention to that and built off of it, and that's how I got interested in it.
Same with me, too, David. I got emails from a number of our listeners telling me about this, something I didn't even know about, and I started studying it. And, Linda, you too? How did this come to you?
Well, I thought it was especially sneaky that on New Year's Eve, December 31st, 2011, while President Obama was still in Hawaii on vacation, that he chose that afternoon when most Americans, their attention would be deflected by New Year's Eve holiday. That's when he signed this NDAA. And remember, he had said that he had originally said, I will not sign this, because he didn't like the wording that left open the possibility that American could end up going through the military side. Well, as I understand it from talking with attorneys, no wording really was restored that would keep the American citizen in the American legal system. It is still in this twilight zone that any of us could be arrested and diverted into military authority like Padilla was, and this is the big dangerous cloud hanging over it, and clearly Obama didn't want people to be paying attention when he signed the 2012 NDAA.
David, you have tried to get some of the mainstream broadcasters to wake up, to look at this. Tell me some of the things you've done, and has it fallen on deaf ears?
I don't know if it's fallen on deaf ears or if it's fallen on ears that are intentionally not listening. Because I have sent, when I first found out about that and I wrote my first article and did my, first thing on it, I have a pretty good feel just from a background in PR that I sort of know what's going to take off, right?
Sure.
And I sent off this email to everybody I knew, every reporter, anchor, producer I've ever worked with, and people that I haven't worked with, just people in my contact list, literally everyone, because it was just so clearly a home run. I figured I'd wake up the next morning and it would be the biggest story around the country, and it would be on Fox News, and it would be on ABC and MSNBC. And, before this bill went any further, it would just be killed.
Yeah.
It would be shot dead. And that's not what happened. I sent out this email and got, no replies from anybody at the national level. And I'm thinking that's really weird. And then I get a reply from one reporter a couple days later, and his whole answer to me is just, that's very interesting. Not even willing to say, I'm going to pursue this, just that's very interesting. And it kind of sent a chill down my spine. And at that point, I sent out a second round of emails, and it was a similar reaction, and I started questioning myself, is this not something that's important to people? But then I would search online for NDAA, and other bloggers were talking about it. The Huffington Post was writing about it, and Forbes magazine, which is not by any means a magazine that exaggerates about things like this.
That's right.
And they were giving it serious attention. So, I just couldn't put the pieces together, and I still don't understand what's really going on there, because this is clearly a huge story.
They probably, David, I would guess, don't understand the significance of this. It blows right over their head. Like you also said, though, it could be done on purpose. Do they think that this falls into the bucket of conspiracy theorists, and they just don't want to go there?
Well, here's the thing with that. A conspiracy theory is no longer a conspiracy theory if A, it's true, and B, it's already happened. I think they sort of had some defense, the mainstream media did, when Obama's administration was saying, don't worry, we've got this, we're going to veto this. So there wasn't all that much outrage, because we sort of thought that he was going to be the last line of defense, and when he did veto it, that he would make a very strong public announcement telling the American people what Congress was trying to do, and then they would remove that provision and move forward, and that would be the end of it. But that's not what happened. At the last minute, as your other guest mentioned, they withdrew their veto threat, and he signed it into law literally on New Year's Eve while people were out getting drunk. And when the media is functioning at a very, very low level, it's basically just watching the ball drop at Times Square, and that's it.
I had heard some stories that Carl Levin, whom I know when he was a Detroit city councilman 100 years ago, that he really wasn't going to be a sponsor of the provision, that he was pushed by the administration to do this. Have you heard anything about that?
Yeah, I've heard reports about that, and I've seen the video where that's claimed. I mean, the deeper down this rabbit hole you dig, you really see that this doesn't make sense, because the support for this was very bipartisan. I mean, the indefinite detention provisions were drafted by Levin, as you mentioned, and McCain, who's a Republican. He's not a Democrat. And they both drafted this. And then, the Senate shot down the Udall Amendment, which would have done away with this provision and allowed them to pass the rest of it, all of the legitimate sections. It still doesn't add up to me. And I've been doing as much as I can to get to the bottom of it.
And, George, one of the voices of reason was Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont. And both before the December 31st, sort of under-the-radar signing by Obama, he had said both, I think, on CNN, and then later he was quoted in a Forbes article, and this was Bernie Sanders making all kinds of appeal that what they needed to do was to kick this out and not put any of this in until there was further understanding. And this is a quote from Bernie Sanders, Vermont. The legislation could give future presidents the authority to throw American citizens into prison for life without charges or a trial. This bill also contains misguided provisions that, in the name of fighting terrorism, essentially authorize the indefinite imprisonment of American citizens without charges. And I'm stressing this only to say that there were reasonable voices that were articulating exactly the heart of this wording that now attorneys in the ACLU are saying are a direct threat to American civil liberties. And it was as if those voices of reason were being ignored, exactly as the point is being made by David, that there was a seemingly unreasonable vacuum around this NDAA that, with strong bipartisan support, fighting it and then for it, that it gets passed under the radar by President Obama on New Year's Eve. And I completely agree with David Simmons that this is not, it's as if something else is going on in the background that none of us have yet seen.
David, who supports the resistance to this law now? Young people, old people? How does it skew?
It's really been across the board. The resistance, from what I can tell, is those who know about it. That's what's so astonishing here. I've spoken with Tea Partiers, Occupy Wall Street people, young people, old people. It spans the whole spectrum. The problem is most people I talk to have heard nothing about it. But those who actually find out, within a very short amount of time, they go from that stage of denial, of thinking they just stumble across a blog post or a video that's inaccurate, to acceptance when they see that the New York Times has covered this, and they did one of their most condemning editorials I've ever seen them do against the Obama administration for this. And once people realize that it's real, then they swing into action and they start telling everybody they know. But the problem is most people just don't know, and the media is, as she mentioned, the media is not doing their job here, and something clearly does not add up.
Right.
I miss the days of Howard Beale from the movie Network, because if we had one of those out there,
we are.
You know what? It's us. I guess it's us.
From the windows. We are saying we won't take this anymore.
Well, there's another one right behind the NDAA. It's called the Enemy Expatriation Act, sponsored by Joe Lieberman out of Connecticut, Charles Dent, the Republican out of Pennsylvania. This would give the government the power to strip citizenship away from Americans without being convicted if they think they could be hostile to the United States. And what is the definition, Linda, of being hostile? Who knows?
Well, terrorism is the new communist from the McCarthy era, and we are working now onto very thin ice that the same kind of